So let's start. It's time to start, I guess. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Although the weather suggests staying at home and sleeping. It's particular pleasure for me to give the start to the ninth already edition of the Center for Institutional Studies Banking Workshop. So we get together annually, and under the same title for almost all the editions. The title is Banking in Emerging Markets, Challenges and Opportunities. And the reason is quite simple, because the world is changing. Banks and banking markets in those countries are changing, and the banking profession itself is changing. But there are always some challenges and some opportunities there to discuss. That's why each October we get together here in HSC to present our new academic results in this field. But before we get directly to the academic program of today's workshop, let me say some thank yous to those people without whom this workshop wouldn't be possible. So first of all, this workshop is always organized by the Center for Institutional Studies, so I'm really grateful to all the people there who are with me in this project for many, many years. And I'm particularly grateful to the organizing team, especially to Sayana, who is behind you. So thank you very much for your help there. Then, of course, I'm really grateful to my program committee, to Vladimir Sokolov, who is here, and to Zuzana Fungasheva, who is unfortunately not here, but she's in Vienna, so maybe that's not that bad. So you are there for many years as well, and I hope to be with you for future editions. Then I must say thank you to the Department of Economic Sciences, the HSC department, for their financial support. Then I'm really grateful to the Bank of Finland, Institute for Economies in Transition, and to the Russia platform Yugend, with the Kent University being behind it, for their support of this workshop. Both it is with us also for many, many years. Kent University is for the first time with us, but I'm really happy that Kuhn being behind the platform and the university. So yes, I really hope that you will be with us also for the next editions as well. Next, this workshop, this banking workshop, is now well known in Russia as a workshop which hopes to attract brilliant keynote speakers, the best keynote speakers the empirical banking academia can offer now. So I must say thank you to our today's keynote, Hans de Vries. Thank you for finding the time in your schedule and for coming here. We'll have the keynote speech after the first coffee break today. And of course, I must say thank you to all of you, to all the participants, to all our guests. And I really hope that today's workshop, will be useful and interesting for you, and you will enjoy it as much as I do every year. So thank you once again for coming, and now we turn to the academic program, but before we start, a small technical note. You may notice that this room is full of complicated video equipment, so the cameras will follow you. You don't need to do anything special to get there into the camera. They're there, yes, over there. But what you need to do is to switch on the mics when you are speaking. The mics are the buttons on your tables, the ones with the mouse and Bosch above the button. So when you are speaking, please switch it on. It will become red. And our technical assistants asked us not to put any papers on these mic buttons, the black ones. So if it is closed with some program or something like that, it will be useless. Yes, all the videos will be available shortly after the workshop, so you will be able to share the videos with your students, colleagues, watch yourself in the evenings, nothing like that. So let's start our first session. Our first presenter is Alexander Kostrov. Please consider something like 20 to 25 minutes for the presentation. The clicker is over there, to leave some time for the discussion and the questions from the audience.
Here. Today I present a chapter of my emerging PhD thesis in the University of St. Gallen. As the title is suggesting you, I'm talking about hidden negative capital in banking and its formation. In fact, it is very related to the keynote speech by Professor Hans de Vries today. Actually, we are talking about zombie lending, and the main issue is the credit, and you consider that from the point of a firm. I consider the same, I think I consider the same thing, but from the point of a bank. So, what is our plan for today? Well, it does not exist well. So, 10 years ago, during the crisis, there was a McKinsey report aimed at corporate bankers. They were telling that little is known about capital management, and they considered that as a big issue. And in their report, they proposed a few guidelines how to improve capital management in the future. And that was quite a fundamental thing, and it was covered by most media resources. 10 years later, nothing changes. Now we are having an article in The Economist telling us that the zombie landing in Europe, and it is not getting better. The problem is still there. So the problem of negative capital in banks is particularly sound in banking systems with certain characteristics. They are large territories, many banks, and lack of public bank level data. If you think about Europe, my message is that it is not a weird problem of developing countries. It is a problem truly global and international one. So if the territory is large with many banks and lack of public data, almost for sure it does exist. The example is Germany, another example is Austria. So almost any country you take, the problem is there. Well, if we talk about developing countries, the problem is even larger. It is intensified by the lack of transparency in general. And transparency somehow helps banks to hide negative capital. Later we will see how. That is why what we one of the purposes of the model is not just to explain how it can happen that negative capital is there, but to show that it is possible to predict and to spot such banks well in advance and to improve remote monitoring. I mean, remote monitoring is important for countries with large territory and many banks, because it is impossible to make field inspections on a regular daily basis. So the roadmap for today, first we talk about the definition of negative capital. We can see the few real-life examples. Then we talk about the product mismatch hypothesis that we introduced in order to explain explanation. We have a small theoretical model explaining how that's possible that negative capital gets larger and appears in general. And we consider an empirical setup. So what we show that our product mismatch hypothesis holds, and we show that the relationship is causal. So we move. An accounting principle guarantees that assets equal to the sum of borrowed funds and capital, which is a trivially closed rate. And we know that capital has to be positive in all times. However, what might happen is that at some point it is discovered that some fraction of assets is no longer there. One would say that at some point large charges are discovered. And at the point when they are discovered, capital is completely wiped out, and we see that there is a haircut on borrowed funds. That is what we call hidden negative capital, because capital becomes a zero, and then in some sense it becomes negative. That is our definition. So the measure of negative capital, what I like most is the ratio of hidden negative capital to borrowed funds. As you can see, it is always between 0 and 1. So the second possible definition, when you divide by the remaining assets, sometimes it takes weird values. Imagine that there are some banks when 99% assets are gone. In that case, the value is too large numerically. That is why I think that the first approach is better when we divide by borrowed funds. Here we consider two examples of two banking systems in the United States and Russia. We take a long time span, and we consider bank failures, because usually they discover negative capital after bank failure. What we do, we see that we have quite a lot of cases. In the United States, about 500, in Russia, about less than 400, but still enough. We see that pre-failure reported capital is positive in both countries. In the United States, it is about 2%. In Russia, it is 18%. So capital is reported to be well positive. However, after careful inspection, it appears that capital is deeply negative. That is the moment when there is a significant charge of assets, mainly through loans. It is a charge of loans. So the idea of this picture is that probably there is negative capital in many operating banks. So how is that possible? There are a few explanations. The first is that misreporting. Banks want to keep operating, that is why they put their books. It means that it is just a fraud, an accounting fraud. Also, a regulator may be aware of poor financial position of banks, but under political pressure, they can pretend to be blind. Also, they may also hope that in the future banks will be better, so they allow some time. They give some time to banks to recover in the future when their financial shock dies out. Moreover, there is a too many to fail effect when it is impossible to relocate all licenses in one point of time. So it's not something distributed in time. However, at the same time, in short term, banks may trade with negative capital, but in the long run, they eventually fail because they change their behavior in a certain way that ultimately leads to their failure, and that is well documented. One of the effects is that they change their lending policy so that they are backward affected by their clients, and eventually they fail. So our main hypothesis is called the product mismatch hypothesis. So we define two ratios. The first is loans to firms divided by assets, and another one is funding from depositors divided by assets. So we say that if two ratios are high at the same time, it is probably signal about negative capital in a bank. So we just take the product, right? If both are high, the product is also high. So that is how we define the mismatch variable. So our hypothesis is that larger value mismatch leads to higher probability of when failure is negative capital and to the larger size of negative capital if it does exist. In principle, that behavior, when the bank is focused on funding by depositors, by private depositors, and lending to firms is quite weird because they earn a smaller or negative interest margin. So that behavior cannot be justified from the point of earning some money. So why does it happen? I would say there are three explanations. The first is called the pocket bank. That is a captive bank that is raising funds from public in order to finance some business, probably related with the owner of the bank. Another is tough competition. So maybe a bank is forced to accumulate money that they can afford, right? If the market is well shared, then they just try to attract private depositors with a high interest rate, and they grant loans to firms that they know better. Also, we have a theoretical model that shows that it is an optimal behavior of the bank to have high loans to firms and high funding by depositors. And that is an optimal solution of the bank's problem. In principle, if you just take a sample of failed banks, of failed trading banks in two countries, we see that it is looking like mismatch is too behind failed banks, both in Russia and in the United States. And so both components are high for failed banks, and finally the product is also high. Mismatch is a product of two ratios. So regarding the theoretical model, I will just provide a small sketch of it without explanation of all details. So imagine we have a bank that is earning some profits during a period of time. So small pie shows then we can call it operating income. That is just interest income minus interest expenses. However, at the end of the period, the bank has to charge off loan. Its ability, but we call it charge off. In the research, it is well documented that if the loan portfolio is high in assets, then charge offs are also high. However, there is a transparency variable that takes values between 0 and 1. In some sense, it characterizes the ability of a bank to hide its problems in the balance sheet. We believe that it depends on funding from depositors. Since private depositors are covered by the insurance, and in general it is well documented in the literature that they are quite careless about monitoring banks' performance. solve that maximization problem subject to constraints. Many of them are technical, like the ratio of loans to firms to assets must be between 0 and 1, and some standard restrictions like the ratio of capital to assets must be above the required level. And we show that under very weak assumptions, it is optimal to have as large as it is optimal to have extremely high loan to firms ratio and quite high deposits from household ratio. I would not call it a corner solution because it is not a corner solution, but it is very close to the corner solution. The assumption that we make here that if a bank has multiple sources of funding, such as households and some other source, another source must be more expensive to the bank. But imagine a highly non-transparent bank who has high incentive to hide and who has the ability to hide charge-off in the balance sheet. It is highly likely that counterparties are aware of this problem and that inequality to be holds. It is very expensive to raise funding from the third parties. So the theoretical model is suggesting that a very high value mismatch is likely in banks as a solution of that maximization problem. So in the empirical setup, we estimate the Heckman selection model that consists of two equations. The first characterizes the probability to have negative capital, and the second one characterizes the size of negative capital. In general, we could apply OLS, but Heckman selection model has a certain advantage. You know, two equations, it is easy to imagine that two equations are driven by the same unobserved characteristics. Say the quality of management. It is quite hard to measure the quality of management, but obviously two equations are affected by it. So the Heckman selection equation is able to make that correction. In some sense, it is an immediate variable problem that can be fixed to some extent. We rest on the assumption that there is, in reality, the capital is negative in some of the operating factors. So, as control variables, we employ a set of ratios from the literature on bank failures and the cost of closing a bank. It exists mainly for the United States, and you see the list is quite standard. The estimation of the model shows that first you see that there is a correlation between the error terms, and that is the main justification to use the Heckman model from the statistical point of view. So there is indeed sample selection. And coefficients have the expected signs. As you can see, the mismatch variable, the coefficient of the mismatch variable is positive, so mismatch increases the probability to have negative capital and increases the size of negative capital if it does exist. So I see that I'm running out of time. That's why I skip most. Okay. I skip most of robustness checks because, you know, to be honest with you, Heckman model is quite outdated, was developed in the 70s. And that is a strong critique of the Heckman model. It is impossible to give a perfect, to defend our model perfectly well, but we can apply robustness checks and remove in the paper. We have a series of robustness checks. One of the most painful things is that the selection must be affected by some extra variables in comparison to the size equation. And it is not easy to find a variable that affects the probability to fail with negative capital, but not the size of negative capital. But we are trying hard to do that, and we are quite consistent with the contemporary literature. seems to be working well. Also, we check different forecasting horizons, and our result is quite robust to that. But I'm just skipping some slides in order to show the most important thing. Also, we show that if we change the estimation window, the result is still there. You see, if the column, if the y is gray, it means that the prediction is significant. So the mismatch variable remains significant throughout periods, and the correlation rho that justifies the use of the factor model is also significant, telling us that there is sample selection. So one could say that what we discover is just correlation. It could be that the stressed bank changes its behavior somehow so that mismatch gets higher. And there is no proof value, right? It could be that the bank finds itself in a poor financial position, so well, we can raise funds from public, we can grant many loans to imitate banking, but we can find a good instrument for the mismatch variable. And the list of instruments is coming from local markets. States in case of the United States, and regions in case of Russia. So what we do, we said that competitive pressure could be one of a few reasons for a mismatch and for hidden negative capital. We say that we measure some characteristics of banks in the local market and use them as an instrument for mismatch. So we we measure the competitive pressure by measuring mismatch of local rivals of the bank and the growth rate of their assets. So for every bank, we define a region of its business by the head office registration. And then we see for every bank what is the value of the instrumental variable suggested by this local rival. So the procedure is well defined how to use the Heckman model with instrumental variables. We do it, and we have defined that the effect of the mismatch is still there. So it seems to be confirmed by the use of the instrumental variable. So the effect of mismatch is causal in nature. Long story short, we contribute in a few ways. I think the most important one is that we propose a theoretical model that justifies the way of hidden negative capital information. We empirically tested and we show that it seems to be relevant. Also, we have a very simple policy implication that the central bank, the regulators, must utilize better or in the first order banks with high mismatch.
Thank you, Alexander. So the discussant is Mikhail Stalbov.
Okay, first of all, let me say thank you to Maria for having me here. Well, being a discussant for this paper is challenging because the quality is high. I believe that even in the present form, it's a strong paper, but still, so the role of being a discussant assumes that I have to sum up the paper. Well, the presentation was quite comprehensive, that's why I'm going to abridge this part. First of all, I should say that the paper which has just been presented is an extended version of the material which I read. Well, that's why the theoretical component was not present. That's why I'm not ready to comment on it here. Well, but as for the empirical part, I should say that the authors introduced the product mismatch hypothesis and its role in shaping the negative capital in banks. Well, and they state that the product mismatch stems from the discrepancy between the sources of funding and how they are located on the asset side of bank balance. So the paper implements the Heckman selection model and takes two countries to validate the main idea: the US and Russia. The authors find that the product mismatch hypothesis really holds, and greater mismatch is associated with high probability of selection, banks with hidden negative capital, and also it leads to a higher magnitude of hidden negative capital after selection. I should say that the major finding here has survived an extensive number of checks, and despite the fact that Alexander noted that Heckman selection model is a bit outdated, it provides accurate out-of-sample predictions. Well, also a point which, if I'm not mistaken, was not mentioned is that the effect of this mismatch is heterogeneous. It is more pronounced in case of smaller banks, and this conclusion is true both in terms of the US and Russian banking system. Well, as for the strong points of the paper, first of all, the major issue is that the authors deal with a vast array of data to craft their research. And the data is mostly hand collected. Also, the talk about product mismatch hypothesis is new in the financial stability literature, and it is a plausible explanation for hidden negative capital formation and consequent default bank payments. The authors propose actually two parsimonious models, the one in the theoretical domain and the other in the economic one. As for the text, it's well structured and actually it's well written, so that's why I have to reiterate my initial conclusion that even in the present form it is a strong piece of research. What shall I advance? Well, in the definition, in the introduction of the product mismatch hypothesis sounds a bit vague. The authors mentioned that there are some other possible mismatches which can be confounding. They mention liquidity and currency mismatches, and of course they can overlap, and that's why it's important to disentangle more clearly what the authors mean when referring to the product, precisely to the product mismatch hypothesis. I will state it more clearly in the introduction section. Also, I have actually a question about the mismatch, regressive mismatch variable, which is used in the multiplicative form as a product, right? Why not try simpler versions of the mismatch variables, just like the following ratios. Loans to firms relative to deposits to households, or the difference between the two relative to assets. Well, at least this may be a component of your robustness check, just to show that the results of. As for the variables used in the econometric analysis, well, pretty much in line with the literature, and they converge to the Camel's approach. Alexander mentioned that the only exception probably is that quality of management cannot be controlled explicitly, right? In this relation, I have the following suggestions. Still, I would try addressing the corporate governance issues, the quality of corporate governance, perhaps such indicators, if available, of course, as ownership concentration, the size of the board could be tried, could be considered. And in general, since the list of potential variables is not that extensive, I would also propose a pre-filtering of regressors by means of Bayesian model averaging procedure. It's a well-known instrument for linear regressions, but still this technique has been adjusted for binary dependent variable regressions for logit and multinomial models by Young et al. In 2005. Perhaps that would be a procedure which would allow to better fit the selection equation. Basically, these were some technical recommendations, and I have some conceptual reflections, not questions actually, but reflections over the paper. Well, first of all, in my view, the product mismatch is not necessarily malign, it's not necessarily bad. Well, actually, that's a common issue which arises when asset liabilities management of a bank is considered. Product mismatch turns malign only due to improper management or mostly improper. Therefore, I would concentrate in the discussion and the policy implications of the paper. I would focus on such issues as relationship lending and try analyzing whether loan portfolios are heavily concentrated or not. Also, I would try taking into account sectoral dimension of lending, because even if there is a higher value of household deposits on the liabilities side, these deposits could be transformed into profitable loans dependent on a particular sector, a particular industry, and therefore a bank can perfectly survive this product mismatch and even generate handsome profit. Therefore, my conclusion in a nutshell is that product mismatch hypothesis is mostly about pocket banks, unsuccessful pocket banks, which may be subject to some very stringent external conditions, and therefore they have to somehow abandon this baseline business model. So it just fails. So, but overall, as I previously noted, the paper is strong, and given that theoretical addition, the theoretical component which has been added. It is an interesting piece of research, and it is quite promising. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe you can comment very briefly.
Thank you very much for your program. Actually, I'd like to respond to only one of them. It is about the use of a much wider set of variables. Here we have two ideas. On one hand, it is possible, but probably with OLS, because variable selection with Heckman is quite wild. If we use simple OLS, we can use lasso, we can many techniques, and it is one direction to develop or to revise the framework. So, but then our idea was to use a very, very simple model and with the same variables, with the same data field procedures for very different concepts. One is small and not so transparent, another one is global and very transparent. And we see that the model works well in both of them. That's why we decided that we take as simple model as we can and check if it works or not. That was my main purpose. But in general, as a robustness check, it is possible to switch to LS and see the wider range of variables. So thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for maybe a couple of questions or comments. Alexei?
Of course, I haven't read the paper. I understand. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I understand that there is a correlation between this measure of the product mismatch with the formation of hidden capital. But what I'm missing maybe a little is the intuition. So why is it the case that banks that have a lot of loans to firms and a lot of deposits of households, that it is easier for them to hide capital? Or so what is exactly the mechanism? Is it that they're able more than other banks, or is it they have a higher incentive to do it? So I guess that's something that was clear.
So I would say we try to explain that in the theoretical model, what they have on their sketch. So they gave that some banks are not transparent. And from the normal behavior of banks, it's impossible to justify their intention to have a low interest money. Because lending terms and attract deposits from people with a low interest margin. In the theoretical model, we show that hiding charging is possible. Only it is not what we show in the common fact, that it is possible to hide charging to long term. Because private loans are less small in size, they're numerous, and they still got documented. So it's much easier to achieve than related with a large corporate loan, where you have a one single counterpart or a few. It's one side of the problem about loans. At the same time, they need a low level of transparency to hide changes. And that's what depositors allow them to do, because they don't have the. When they bring two things together, they get high research, high profit. And finally, they hide charges. That was the idea of the model.
Thank you. Hans?
Thank you. So my question, I think, follows up a bit on what Alexei was asking. So you're immediately using this interaction effect, right? And so I'm wondering how you can discriminate. Let's say you could have a high deposits to assets ratio on the one hand and a low loans to assets ratio. And you would exactly have the same number basically when you have a high loans to asset ratio and a low deposits to household ratio. So I'm wondering, why you maybe you did that, and I didn't read the paper also. So why you are not trying to first focus, let's say, on the factors themselves, and then try to see whether there is something specific about the interaction. So I'm just wondering, how you can discriminate between the movements of those two separate components, because the same number may have many alternative interpretations. If you. Thank you.
Okay, and the final comment from Mata.
It would also be a follow-up, and sorry to have my back here. So, similar idea. So, it would be interesting to run a sort of a horse race between household loans as well. Because, I mean, you gave the example of the US, and the banks provided lots of credit to subprime retail borrowers. So you can actually use corporate loans versus household loans and see whether the same dynamics are there or not. Because it may just, the corporate loans over total assets may just reflect how much loans the banks are providing. So it's parallel to, I think, earlier comments. And one other thing is, I see the argument of like having smaller margins because of, you know, like high cost of deposits and low income from the corporate loans. But there is a cost from the liquidity, right? In the sense that household deposits are much more stable compared to, for example, short-term funding, wholesale funding, and there's a big literature on that. So it would be interesting just to run like a horse race between different, you know, source of funding, etc. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we move on, and the next presenter is Vladimir Sokolov. You are copying the slides, okay?
Thank you very much for coming here. Please allow me to present this interesting paper, Interbank Networks of the Real Economy, that is from Russian banking panic. It's a joint work with Dmitry Lidan from Fast Business School Berkeley and Norman Shulkov from Lausanne. And myself. These two authors of mine, they have done some quite extensive work in networks, but in other markets, in particular bond markets. They quite good data on over-the-counter markets in bonds, so they have good experience in this. And I did some work in banking, and we decided to join our efforts and write an interesting paper on networks back in banking. So, as you know, researchers in banking and overall economists are very interested in knowing how banks affect the real economy. And recent financial crisis and other exogenous shocks presented great opportunities for the researchers to study the lending channel in quite detail. So researchers who were able to identify exogenous shocks and control or indigeneity the supply and demand for loans, wrote some interesting papers and pretty much pinned down that banks do have a real effect on the firms, on the economic sector, and lending channel is quite significant. So, however, there is also another channel through which banks could affect firms, is the intermediation channel. And I guess it's just the unavailability of the data prevented people from looking into this one. And the intermediation channel in this context is the bank's facilitations of inter-firm payments. So as you might know, most firms, when they deal with each other, they sell goods and services, they extend invoices to each other, and then normally those invoices are paid through the banking system, through the payment system of banks. So firms having an account with one bank transfer funds to the account of a firm in another bank. So that's intermediation services that banks provide, and there is even some theory behind this, that there are some liquidity shocks that firms face, and banks actually help to smooth out those shocks because there are time gaps in receipts and expenditures of firms, cash receipts, cash expenditures, and banking sector allows to smooth out those time gaps. Banks in this context perform very important social function. And banks themselves can co-insure each other on the interbank market. So when banks themselves suffer from, liquidity shortage, or on the reverse, they have a liquidity surplus, there is an interbank market which allows them to share the liquidity with each other. So we want to study the effect of this intermediation bank's role in facilitating the firm's payments, and focus, luckily or unluckily for economy, there was some interesting bank panic episode in Russia, which we take as an exogenous event, allowing us to look how variation in banks' exposure on the interbank market affects the ability to facilitate firms' payments. The data which we use, as I said, are quite unique, but other researchers have used it previously. It comes, it's Russian data. Back in 2004, there was basically a leakage of payment system data from the Central Bank of Russian Federation. And a few researchers wrote some good papers on this, in particular Mironov, Zhuravskaya. If you want to read extensively about the scope of the data, the source, the limitations, I would refer to the articles. They have the whole sections about this data set. They do political economist type of studies. They identify some suspicious payments around mayor elections, and make arguments about corruption and so on and so forth. However, we thought that the data is quite rich in its network structure, because basically you have network of banks and you have network of firms which are interconnected with each other. So just to give you the scope, raw data set consists of 123 million payment orders. Those the unit of reservation is the payment order between two firms. There are about 1 million of entities, which includes both firms, individuals. It could be, some pensioner paying to another pensioner for something. It includes municipalities, government, state enterprises, so pretty much the whole economy. However, we focus only on business payments. So we're able to identify in the data only payments between firms for business purposes. So we exclude taxes payments, individuals, municipalities, and just firm-to-firm payments. And here just a brief diagram just to visualize for you the data and the source. So basically, as I told you, firms conduct some economic activity between each other, exchange goods and services, then one firm extends an invoice, and then asks another firm, the paying firm, to pay. So firm R is the receiving firm, firm P is the paying firm, so firm P pays for the goods and services, has an account in the bank of its own. This firm has an account, so invoice will mention, please pay this amount Y to my bank for my services. So then this firm will make this payment order, which will go through, and it goes through the payment system of the central bank, and here central bank registers this transaction, which includes IDs of all these subjects, the amount, the purpose, and basically that was the source of the data leakage back in 2004. So it's quite nice for us. And there could be many configurations. It could be one firm just deals with one bank. There could be a firm dealing with many banks. So you name it. We have some summary statistics in the data, how many banks per firm, how many on the recipient side, on the paying side. So it's quite extensive. Just to appreciate maybe the scope of the network, this is network which you can do some software called Gephi. Gives you just the major banks, how they're connected, just to see the picture. Interestingly, most business payments at that time went through Sberbank, not through the central bank. The event which we focus on. In 2004, in May, there was a banking panic. And this graph illustrates it plots the number of bilateral connections on the interbank market, which we can also identify in the data. And then after the panic, those connections severely dropped. In the draft of the paper, we have also graphs for the average volume, total volume. They didn't actually significantly drop. What happened is actually many banks stopped dealing with each other, but the remaining banks, especially state banks, continued operating on the interbank market, it appears, and supported it. So this bank panic did not result in economic crisis. And it's well documented also in the business literature of that time. Interestingly enough, I was not aware. I knew that when you were studying interbank market, so you sent me the source. And interestingly, good for us that somebody already documented the panic itself. Because we're not interested in studying, in this study, the panic. We use it as an event to look into payment system transmission shocks. So for us, it's an event, but it has already been studied by people, 3 persons present here. So I knew presenting in this workshop will be of value for me, but actually I didn't know until yesterday that it was very valuable because Koen and his co-authors already wrote something on this and actually knows quite a lot about it. So again, if you want to read about the panic, go to this source. It will explain to you what the panic was. But basically, it was exogenous event. 2 banks lost licenses, mostly for money laundering purposes, and it was not related to macroeconomic conditions, banking conditions, but it caused severe, as you see, change in the composition network in terms of how many banks were dealing on the bank market. The following graph for us illustrates an interesting picture. Maybe it explains in a way the panic. Despite the fact that those banks were rather mid-sized, they were small, so they represent those 2 banks, and other banks had lost licenses over that episode in May, June. If you plot on the horizontal axis the pre-panic degree of centrality of those banks, it turns out they were very central for the network. So, for example, the bank Credit Trust that lost its license was number 12, much higher than, well, not much higher, but above their line, for example. So, interestingly, I guess market understood that those banks are quite central to the interbank market. And then when the licenses were withdrawn and other banks which also suffered license withdrawal, so that caused, maybe in a way contributed to the panic. A negative relationship shows that the more central you were in the pre-panic situation, the more connections you would lose after the panic. So we didn't explore this, but in itself, it's an also interesting relationship. So what we're going to see, study, is how affected banks by the panic. Basically, how the fact that bank lost its connections on the interbank market, how it will affect its intermediation services for firms conducting, facilitating firms' payment flows. So bear in mind, these banks, affected banks, they did not get liquidated. Nothing happened to them. It's just they got disconnected from other banks on the interbank market. Firms still use them for their businesses, but we will see how those that lost most of connections change the intermediation services relative to banks which did not lost connections on the interbank market. We don't have theory for that yet, but the basic idea is that if you use interbank market, as I told you previously, you are able to co-insure with other banks your liquidity shocks. If you get disconnected, you lose that ability, and basically the time gaps between payments will increase, the costs of liquidity management will increase, and it will also spill over on firms and your ability to facilitate their payments. That's the basic mechanism which we have in mind will work in the setting and affect the firm's payments. So here we will have 2 hypotheses. One is that increase in paying banks disconnectedness on the interbank market, first of all, is a signal of high likelihood of banks' fragility, which results in high credit risk for the paying firm, and firm will switch its payments from more affected banks to less affected. So it's one economic motivation for firms to switch from banks that lost their interbank connections. It's a signal that other banks perceive that bank as fragile. So my account in this bank, so I better switch to others. And another is, I just mentioned to you previously, this decrease in bank connectedness on the interbank market reduces its ability to basically manage liquidity, And this increase in cost of liquidity management will also affect firm-to-firm payments. In particular, will cause decline of firm-to-firm payments through such affected bank. Here are dependent variables. First, we study intensive margin, so variation within two firms, how share of banks will change depending on how they got affected by the bank failure. So here is the variable is the volume of transfers between two firms through two banks, paid bank and receiving banks. And here is the total volume of these two particular firm-to-firm payments. So it's basically this variable represents between two firms, I and J. What's the share of banks P and R in the total transfers? Okay? So, and that will be our first dependent variable. Independent variables will be, first of all, dummy variables indicating the breakage of the link between banks P and R on the interbank market, establishing new link, staying connected, or never being connected on the interbank market. Then our second dependent variable is bank loss of connection. Is that basically variable we saw in the graph. In a way, it's we calculate how many connections a given bank, let's say it's a paying bank, had before the paying, how many connections it had after the paying, and then just take the difference. So it shows the connection loss. So the empirical specification is the following. It's a panel regression, where because of this multidimensionality of the panel, we could use, in particular, we rely on interactive paying and receiving firm fixed effects. So all variation and all coefficient identification comes within two firms across bank pairs. So having such an interactive fixed effect allows us to control for a lot of this heterogeneity, which is common, unobserved heterogeneity for the firms. And when we look at variation across bank pairs, paying and receiving bank status. So here the status after the crisis, the interbank market connection was lost, newly established, or never established. Okay? Then second specification is similar in idea, but here we look not at bank pairs, but bank themselves. So the degree of connectedness loss by paying bank and the receiving bank. So here are the estimation results of the first specification. So they come nicely as expected. Significance is extremely high, statistical, because I guess of the large sample size. So talking for the whole sample, it's about 2 million observations. Then we break it into 4 subsamples. According to the following criteria, if the paying bank was large, belonging to the top decile, 10 deciles of bank, the rest are small banks. So here we say both paying and receiving banks are large, both paying and receiving banks are small, here paying bank is small, receiving bank is large, and the reverse. And then we see that if within two firms, I and J, the connection between banks P and R was broken, pretty much firms will reshift their payments. And here's the percentage points. So about by 40 percentage points within two firms, the payment flows will be routed away from this pair, which lost their connection, relative to the reference category, which is omitted here, but which is stable. So those banks that stay connected to the interbank market. So next category is a new connection. Here we see that it works the most in terms of the size of the coefficient if the receiving bank was large. So for large recipient banks, if a smaller bank or another large bank connect with each other after the payment, they observe increase in payment transfers through that link, relative to the link of banks in the same category, but which were just previously connected and not newly connected. And never connected, mostly negative, so relative to the category which stay connected through the paying, and never connected always have lower share of transfers within two firms. So results are intuitive. There is not much variation across different subcategories. It just shows that, as expected, there is some transmission of a shock from the interbank market to firms' payments on intensive margin. Firms reroute payments from affected banks. This is a result for the second specification when we have the same sample, but instead of looking dummy variables for the status of pairs of banks, we just look at the degree of disconnectedness of the paying bank and the receiving bank. Everything here is again highly statistically significant. Coefficients are negative, as you would expect. You can interpret it as a 1% loss in, let's say, bank receiving degree is the results in 1% loss in share of this bank, receiving bank share in interfirm payments. What's interesting is that loss for the receiving bank is higher than for the paying bank, which means it's easier for firms to, because you see the data is directional, it comes from the paying firm, goes through the paying bank, through the receiving bank, and the payment ends up in the receiving firm. So I guess it's, and the dependent variable is changing the share of those banks. So it's easier for the paying firm to switch away from affected receiving bank, because the receiving bank is a bank of another firm. But it's more difficult for you to switch away from your own paying bank. So I guess that's how one can interpret the difference in sizes of these two coefficients. Next, we come, but you see, so far we started intensive margin, which was interesting, but it doesn't give us the announced topic, the real effect. It's just, you know, there is some financial shock, firms observe that, and they just reroute their payments away from affected banks to unaffected banks. But where's the real effect? So in order to study the real effect, we need to look at the extensive margin. So if indeed this panic affected the growth of interfirm payments, so we need to collapse the banking dimension and look only at the growth of payments across between two firms INJ. So now the dependent variable is growth of firm payment between the firms INJ. And independent variables will be now at the firm level its exposure to the banking crisis, banking pain. So here, let's say this is firm I. It deals with a number of its banks, paying banks, P. So we calculated this variable, how many connections this bank lost during the panic. And here, the weight of this bank in the pre-panic period for this ice firm payments. So it's a predetermined variable, and it's basically a firm exposure is a weighted average where the weights are the weights of these bank's businesses for the given firm, and the variable which has been weighted are losses of those banks in terms of their connections on the interbank market. The same is done for the receiving firm J. Then, unfortunately, now we cannot use interactive fixed effect for the paying and receiving firms because we lose the dimensionality of the panel. Now it's just firm to firm. But now we have to run two separate regressions where we use, for example, here paying firm fixed effect, and coefficient beta will be now identified for variation across recipient firms J within this paying firm. And the reverse will be for another specification where we fix the recipient firm and identify beta variation within paying firms. Again, the literature spends a lot of time on how nice those fixed effects are, controlling for, again, many things, and allowing to have causal interpretation in such settings. So the first specification gives interesting result. Coefficients on recipient firm exposure are statistically insignificant, which, given the large sample size, means there is no effect. So basically, if the recipient firm was, in our measure of exposure, affected by the banking panic, it has no effect on growth of interfirm INJ payments. However, for the second regression, where we fix the receiving firm and look at the variation of exposure with paying firms, we see that for specification where the paying firm was small, which intuitively makes sense, the results are statistically significant, and it means, has the following interpretation. If the small firm initiates a payment and it works through the bank, its own bank, which was affected, it's a bank high paying firm, then indeed it has been effect of about 0.10% decline in growth of inter-firm banking payments. So for small firm, the banking panic on the interbank market will have real effect in the sense of how transfers between firms are conducted. So here's the conclusion. So 2 minutes, thank you. So we use this, first of all, unique data set. Second of all, nice exogenous event of bank panic, which was not caused by economic or banking sector reasons. And then we find that, first of all, at intensive margin, affected banks see loss of a share of their businesses in firms' payments. So banks that totally lose their connections on interbank market, they see within the pairs 8% decline of payments routed through these banks. And here is the measure of decrease in connectedness with respect to the whole market. It's almost 1-to-1, so 1% decrease in connectedness results in a 1% share loss of inter-firm payments. And this one is of the real effect. And it's economically not that big, but still sizable. 1% increase in paying firm exposure to the banking panic results in a 0.1% decline on inter-firm payment growth through these banks. But it only works for small firms and their banks. So that's the result which we have at this point. And yeah, this is a first draft, and this is a very new paper, and maybe things will change quite a bit later. So thank you.
So the discussion is full course.
Okay, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure discussing this paper. It's really interesting. So what is the story of the paper? First of all, it's a really cool idea. It's a really nice data set, a lot of data. It's been used before, indeed, by one of authors to look mainly at tunneling and corruption. But now they're using it to look at basically the relation between the bank market and the real economy. What is the research question? To say in one sentence, the idea is okay, if you have a freeze on the interbank market, will this freeze have some real economic effects? And the real economic effects is basically, the idea is here intermediation, or payments among firms hindered by this crisis. That's the idea. And so how do you do it empirically? And you just listen to the story of Florida. You have a connectedness drop. So you have interbank payments at the CBR, and if this connectedness of these banks drop, will need to drop in from the firm payments through this bank. That's essentially, and I mean, this is a very, very shortcut I'm making here, but this is the story. And the result is, yes, there is a big effect. And in fact, especially for small firms, it's larger. And there are a few underlying assumptions. The first underlying assumption is that the idea is that the firms make choices. So somehow the drop in interconnectedness or disconnectedness is a signal of the bank's fragility. Firms observe this and then they reroute their payments. This is something I will quarrel with or argue with. First of all, do firms observe it in the first place? Or do they just see that the bank cannot do their payments anymore? And second, are firms so smart to understand this as a signal of fragility, or maybe it's the signal of bank relations or something else? So you can discuss about this. And the second one, which is I think more important, is the underlying assumption is that the bank number topology didn't change during the crisis. And during the paper, you've seen all the result tables. And the result tables always have these 5 columns. And the first four columns are essentially big to big, small to small, big to small, small to big. So he's cutting the network into four sections, and they're essentially assuming these sections remain the same over the crisis. The policy doesn't change. But this is something which is really tricky, I think, because it did change. So this is something from a very old paper. Alexei will recognize this. But so what are these lines? These lines were simply the share in total system-wide interbank payments from the solid line is big to big, and then the other lines are small to small, small to big, big to small. And you see what happened in 2004 down here. And you see the solid line jumps up massively. So what happens in 2004, the big banks cut off everybody else. They cut off the small banks, and they mainly start lending to each other. The biggest decrease is the small to small. So you see the small to small, this is the dotted line there, price, this one here, actually. That rose a lot over time and that took almost completely crashed. So what happened is the whole network substantially changed. The topology really changed. Well, throughout the paper, if you cut the sample, small to small, big to big, you do it across the crisis. So this is, I think, something you have to think about, because the topology does change. So I like the assumption that matching depends on size. That's obviously true, but also the matching changes at the moment you observe your shock. And this is tricky, because that question is that, okay, small banks are the norm. Why is that? Is that because, and the small firms usually are with small banks, and if small banks are cut from the system, then the reason why small firms have more is just because small banks, the reason then is that the policy changes. Then you assume it doesn't. So that's something you have to think about. Another thing, which comes from the paper you refer to, this is just a table from our paper. Basically what it is saying, so the R-thing are connections, it's relationships. And the C thing is the crisis curve. And so, but basically, this is very simple definition showing that the likelihood that you have a connection, D, the dependent variable, is having a connection. And this figure, this table, shows that if having a connection really depends on having a relationship, and especially so in the crisis. So the interaction effect, RFC, which is one measure of relationship, and RC, it's another measure of relationship. You see the interaction effect is very, very strong. This is saying essentially those banks that had a long relation because they had many connections before, or because they had mutual connections before, were much more likely after the crisis also to have a connection. So the drop in connectedness is maybe not so much a signaling fragility as it is signaling relationship and relationship banking. So this question is the interpretation that this is just about fragility rather than about something else. So is there some kind of, and you could even ask yourself the question, I'm going to ask it at the end, maybe it is the case that firms that have more connections and more relations, if you trade all the time, your banks will also have more relations. And maybe this is really a story about relations and relations falling apart, much more than about fragility. All kinds of crazy things to make this work. This is from an older paper where we had the 98 and the 2004 class. And so you see indeed, so the dotted line is indeed the interbank loans. That's what they say, right? The number of activity on the interbank connections fund. But the green line is the number of active banks. But you also see the green line falls. So there's a number of small banks that are cut from the market altogether. They're not active anymore. They have zero connections. And they used to have connections. And I don't quite know at the moment how the paper deals with this. Because I assume, or I presume, since you have all these fixed effects, in fact, that these then drop from the regression altogether. But I think a big part of the effect is probably there. And it may be, in that sense, underestimated. Because some firms will be with banks, and often small firms with small banks in some region, and the bank is cut completely from the system. And these guys will probably lose a lot, and you're not capturing these. So in that sense, it may be an underestimation. And I don't know how to deal with it. It's something you have to think about, I think. Because by using all the fixed effects, you cut the banks that are cut, and they're the ones that suffer the worst. Suffer the most. This is a very recent paper of actually a month ago in Nature Scientific Reports, where we look at fundamental functioning of the bank market in Russia. And so what you see there, so you have to focus on this part of the graph. So the colors are just the maturities. Black is a 1-day maturity, orange is 2 to 7 days maturity, and green is 31 to 90 days maturity. And what we see is what happens in the issuance network of the bank market. It's not only that the black colors, the overnight ones, but also the 2 to 7 days, and especially the 31 to 90 days, will drop massively. So there's something with maturity is going on also. There's some maturity game going on. We don't quite understand it, but I just want to understand exactly how the Central Bank of Russia payments data actually capture this. This is payments between banks, and I don't know how this maturity contracts are in these payments. Are they at the moment that you pay back, that you see the payment, or how does it actually work? Because a lot of contracts are in these cards. So if you only see the payments, what you don't see is I do not roll over the contract. And not the liquidity shock. It's banks not rolling over existing contracts. So the one thing is not paying anymore, but one thing is not rolling over the past loan. And then that's really liquidity shock. So I would wonder how you look at this. So this is one part is these connections. You treat them as a random shock, and I think they're not completely random, and I don't know how to deal with it, you should have it. Another part is what the paper neglects completely is prices. So you talk about connectedness, but the big part about access to finance, it's not having a loan or not, but paying for them, how much you pay for them. And you see that after the crisis, there was a real hike in interest rates. In fact, in the standard reports paper, we show, so how should you look at this figure? This is maturity figures from very short, 1 day, to very long, 2 years, and the colors show you the interest rates. And you see that in the 2004 crisis, it all looks very similar. And this line is basically the yield curve. It's basically the long minus the short rates. And that goes to zero. That's all over the same. So basically what happens is that during the crisis, interest rates go up massively, also for short contracts as opposed to long contracts. And they go up especially for banks that are not connected. So we do the same trick as before. We look, okay, these interest rates, do they go up more or less for banks with previous connections? And you see that interest rates in the crisis go up massively. So there's a big constraint to access to liquidity, but less so, strongly less so for banks that have previous connections and strong connections. So again, connections do seem to play a role in your shock. So I wonder how, so basically, which brings me to the last slide. And it's another question, and I don't know whether you need to have to solve it, but you need to think about it. I think is, okay, how do these interbank lending networks form? If you have these firm data, imagine you have, and you showed actually many pictures of change, firms paying to other firms and banks in between. But I imagine, okay, if you have a production chain, if I'm a raw resources firm, and you guys are a finished product firm, usually you have to pay to me all the time. I don't pay to you. If I'm in raw materials, you guys pay to me. So basically, we have a business connection, there's a permanent payment flow. That means that our banks are much more likely also to have a relation. Because in the end, your bank will usually have a shortage and might have a surplus if you have a strong relation. But if you look, so this is very simplistic, if you do it at the network level, it means that firms that have more and more stable relations, their banks will also have more stable relations on the interbank market. So in the end, since you find that this shock relates to shock in payments, and I'm saying the shock is less prevalent for banks that have relations, maybe also the same is true for funds that have relations. So again, you have this relation question, and to what extent is this really a story about relations within the network? That's a question. So that requires some So summing up, it's truly interesting. So I don't want to be critical. I find it's really interesting. It's a very good idea. I really want to look at results. But my point is we have questions about how you define the shock. The size might change, changes in the crisis. The relation among banks matter a lot during the crisis, and they are neglected altogether. So especially, so we know small banks are cut, but not all of them. Half of them survive. So most likely, the small banks that survive in the relation with big banks are the ones that had previous relations. And this is a big thing, I think. And you can capture it because you have the payment data in the past. So it's possible. Also, you have interest rates or prices that network connectedness that are neglected altogether. And also, some small banks completely disappear. They're gone. Often they're not bankrupt, but they drop from the network altogether. So these are questions I think you have to think about. But generally, we want to see results. It's really interesting. Okay.
Thank you very much. So I guess you can comment during the coffee break, okay? Yes, let's go to some questions. Yeah,
So really interesting. So I basically have two questions, if you will, or two comments more. One is more on the potential intertemporal unfolding of these effects. So I wasn't sure exactly about, let's say, your event period, but I can imagine, that maybe, let's say, the disconnection might only be something which is short term, and in the long term, maybe they are re-establishing. So I'm wondering, whether you could think more about, how this potentially gets resolved at a later stage. The second thing is, my question is more on potential contagion from one firm to another. That is, so if there is a shock to the interbank market, I'm expecting money from you, from one of my clients. In the end, I do not receive it because, the bank is basically cut out. So, does this have, let's say, contagion effects towards payments from other firms? So again, it's more like an intertemporal thing, so how do those potential linkages, somehow unfold over time? And then if I may, a third, very short, is, so I'm also wondering whether you don't want to make a distinction between, let's say, banks which are heavily borrowing in the interbank market versus banks, which are basically depositing a lot in the interbank market, because, let's say the impact in terms of, the effects you're going to have might be quite different. But really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess it relates to tools also a question that we need to study temporal dimension more carefully. Here, I did mention that it's just 2 periods, pre and post, and it's average of 6 months after, 6 months before, and data. So it's just, and then everything is cross-sectional after that. Indeed, what happens on a day-to-day basis could be also interest in before and after that. Potentially could be asked and studied. About banks being net lender or net borrower, yes, indeed, we looked at this at some point, and that but we didn't study it yet. I don't know yet how to incorporate it, but indeed, if you look, some banks are always net lenders, some banks are always net borrowers. But again, in some way, we are agnostic to the interbank market as such. We just thought there is a severely sharp decline in connectedness, and another feature which is related to your question is persistence. They stay disconnected, which also needs explanation. Why is it persistent? We don't have answer to that yet. Maybe you studied it yourself. So yeah, I think all this potentially, and what you asked about firm payments in the last slide. Indeed, actually that's how we started this work. We started this work as how shocks just overall to firms' payments affect other firms. And then we thought, oh, then why don't we look at this nice exogenous payment? That would be a neat exercise. We started with firms. Thank you. Yeah. a lot to think about.
Thank you. Maybe some other questions? Yeah.
Really short question. It's about the trend of bank-to-bank relationships, which started like around 1000, and then from the beginning of 2004, it got like tripled almost. Yeah, 3000. And then dropped back to 1000. So, I mean, as much as drop is interesting, it's also interesting why that many relationships were established at the beginning of 2004. Though your data didn't show. Your trends were very sharp, but because like it's really going up and then it's exploding, and that made me.
I don't have an academic answer to this question. We didn't investigate it, but business press at the time was saying that there was actually a boom. So some banks which were net borrowers, they relied on the interbank market as a major source of liquidity and funding. So they would invest long term, borrowing short term. Okay. So they could buy this building by borrowing on the interbank market.
And then one would be related to Hans.
Then boom, crash.
Who is being what in the internet market. But that also helps you a little bit, I think, if you argue that these relationships sort of show some sort of fragility.
Yeah.
So in the 90% of the reports paper, we look into this in detail, and we see that the intermediation is mainly in the short terms. If you go to longer terms, we have sense and sources. Sometimes we're only giving loan loans or getting loans. But in today's markets, they have received. In the loan market, it's really like 6 months sources. And it's something you can maybe split. I don't know whether the CBRA has security.
Yeah.
You have insurance also.
Yeah.
So it's something we have also prices on this.
It's not really because it's in language, yes.
Because a lot of information there in terms of shopping prices. Prices probably not.
Yeah, price we exclude because it's a mess to capture. Because the data has description of the payment and it's in words. So you have to process that, identify the nature and the price. Yeah. I mean, it's potentially possible, but it's a lot of work.
Yeah, very briefly.
Again, this work is just beginning, and we need to think deeper on the mechanisms that you say.
To look at something else that was not done before, because you're not looking at the banking industry per se, just for that. I think we need to do this work. And it may be
Then to be fair to the paper, the word switching was used a few times.
Yes,
And
switching
then they
goes.
talk about switching. So the last results are proof of switching first. So they don't touch it directly with the fact that they find the losses of that those specific banks. They see the big paying down. So paying transaction is a proof of switching cost. That's really important. So if they're trying to go there, it's still a bit sketchy.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's stop here. Thank you very much for this very nice session, and now let's enjoy the coffee. It's in room 433 downstairs a little bit. Okay, see you in 1 hour. In half an hour. No.
Yeah, good question.